some new faces here. So tonight we're going to talk about dying. Something we all have to do. And it's kind of funny we have to talk about this because we've done it so many times. But somehow we just don't remember. So we have to talk a little bit about the death and dying process from the Tibetan Buddhist point of view. And this is a talk that Veronica requested that I give, and specifically on the dissolution of the elements in the dying process. So this is assuming that we understand that we are made of the 5 elements. Yesterday's talk on the mandala, we talked a little bit about the elements. So from this worldview, it's seen that our bodies are made out of earth, water, fire, air, and space. The earth element is the solidity of the body, the bones, the flesh. That what gives us support and strength. That's the earth quality or the earth element of the body. The water element of the body is the fluids of the body, the blood, the lymph. The fluids of the body is the water element. The fire element is the heat of the body, our temperature. If we're dead, there's no heat in the body, right? The air element is the breath. It's also the movement of nerve impulses, or movement in general, moving our limbs, walking, that's all considered an air element activity. And finally, the space element is our consciousness, our mind, or our awareness. So these are the 5 fundamental constituents of the body. And in the dying process, these elements dissolve. And they dissolve in order of the most dense to the most subtle. So the order that they dissolve in is the earth first, the densest, then water, then fire, then air, then space. So we're going to talk about each of those phases, what it looks like as an observer, if we're attending to somebody who's in the dying process, and also what it's like to experience that, each of the dissolutions. But the other thing that we have to talk about a little bit is our subtle body, because the dissolution process is actually the dissolution of our subtle energies in the body, and the elements are dependent on that. So when we die, when our physical body dies, the subtle energies are dissolving and leaving the body, and there's all these physical signs. So we have to talk a little bit about that, the subtle body, the energy body, and some of you may be familiar with this idea. So besides our physical body, or what my teacher calls our meat body, is a body that we can't see, but some of us can see it, and we can certainly observe and feel this body. And the body is made up of a system of winds, or energy, or prana. In Tibetan they use the word wind, or lung, so in English it gets translated as winds. So if you read Tibetan medical texts or tantric texts, they'll talk about the winds, but they're talking about prana, for those of you who are familiar with that word. And a system of channels, or networks, for which this energy flows. And in short, the channel system is based on a central or main channel that runs through the vertical core of our body, from the crown of our head, down in front of our spine, down to 4 fingers below the navel. That's the root, or the trunk, of this channel system. Some people call it the central channel, or in Tibetan they call it Uma. In Sanskrit, the Sushumna. Okay, so some of you, if you have a little yoga background or you do pranayama, you might hear it by that name, Sushumna. In English, it's usually translated as central channel. It's about the thickness of our thumb. That's the main branch. And besides that are two smaller branches that go on either side of the main branch. And they begin at the top of our nose and travel down either side, all the way down to the bottom, and then come back inside the base of the central channel. And these two channels are called different names. There's one on the right and there's one on the left. You could say that one is for the masculine principle and one is for the feminine principle, or the solar and the lunar energies. And then along certain areas of the central channel are the chakras. I think many of you have heard that word, chakra. Chakras are places where there's many, many, many of these little channels concentrated. Okay, there's chakras, the main points on the body. And those chakras branch out. So inside these channels flows this energy, this wind, lung, prana. And there's 5 different kinds of this energy, the 5 different winds that are associated with the different chakras, that are associated with the different elements. So when we die, these winds you could say they evaporate, dissipate. So the element that's dependent on that wind dissolves or is not as present. And the physical structure of the body that was dependent on that, we see the physical changes. So the dying process begins with this subtle wind losing its force or leaving the body or disintegrating, which in turn causes that element to lose its energy, which in turn causes us to see certain things in the physical body. Okay, so this is the Tibetan view of the dying process. It begins on an energy level in a systematic way. Okay, so the first element to dissolve is the earth element. And when the earth element dissolves, this can actually take a long time in a person who's maybe elderly, is not particularly sick, and maybe dies of natural causes. We can observe the earth element dissolving when somebody begins to become more feeble. Their body becomes weak. They might shrink, actually physically shrink. Suddenly, seems like somebody shrinks. They're not as active anymore. They don't want to walk around. They don't want to do anything. They don't have energy. They might start to feel fear because there's a sense of the ground beneath them giving way. So they have more fear. All these are kind of behaviors that you start to see in some elderly people. And they're not particularly dying at that time. We wouldn't say that they were dying, but actually the earth element is starting to dissolve, and they're starting to show these signs of weakness, of fear, of their body shrinking, their body becoming more feeble, maybe shaking. They don't have strength, they don't have energy. So this is a sign that the earth element is starting to dissolve, and for some people this might go on for years. I watched this in my grandfather, for example. He died at the age of 98. And he was a very tall man, 6'3". And in a matter of a year, he shrunk. And suddenly he changed. He wasn't active. He wasn't independent anymore. He had to be put in a nursing home, for example. He became more disoriented. And I could tell that this is the earth element is now starting to dissolve. When the earth element dissolves, the wind that flows from the navel chakra down through the legs, that's called the downward voiding wind. Okay, this is one of the 5 winds, begins to dissolve. Right? So this is the energy where we get our groundedness, where we make that connection with the earth. begins to dissolve. So we begin to lose the connection with the physical earth. And the navel chakra, the chakra at the lower end of the body, begins to dissolve. So other things that we start seeing is a loss of appetite, for example. They're not so interested in eating anymore. They might not make the effort to cook for themselves, or they just might not like the same foods that they liked. This is a sign that the navel chakra is beginning to dissolve. And that downward, that wind that moves down the body is beginning to weaken. The sense organs, we have the 5 senses that are also related to the 5 winds and the 5 elements and the 5 chakras. And the sense is the eye, vision, seeing. So their vision starts to get much weaker. You also notice that the vitality in their skin gets less and less. They get pale, or they get a grayish kind of hue to their skin. So this continues until a person starts to really get concerned and say, okay, this person is really needing help or needing some kind of care. Their physical strength or their physical health diminishes to the point where they start to need care. Their experience, one of their experiences is one of fear, because they start to feel the ground beneath them, their solidity beginning to dissolve, even though they wouldn't describe it that way. But maybe they're afraid to go out. Maybe they're a person who liked to go to different places and now they don't want to go anywhere. Or they have sort of fears of, they might start showing signs of paranoia, but they start showing more signs of fear or insecurity, more dependency. Sometimes they can feel as though they're falling. When the earth element is really diminishing and the last of the earth element is dissolving, they might start to literally feel like they're falling and keep asking for you to put pillows behind their head or need supports. They also start to see strange mirages. They might start seeing things, and they might tell you, they see something, but it's not really there. So as the vision starts to diminish, they start seeing mirages or seeing things that aren't there. Then as the earth element and that wind that is associated with it, the downward voiding wind and the navel chakra, complete their stage of dissolution, the water element then starts to be the predominant element, because the earth element is now depleted so much. Now the water element comes in, and we start noticing the shift to water element dissolution. By this time, a person is probably bedbound. This may be a person in hospice or a person who has been considered terminally ill. They're probably bedbound, not moving around a lot anymore. The water element is dependent on the wind that is stationed in the heart chakra. It's called the life-holding wind. So the heart chakra begins to dissolve. And the sense associated with this are the ears. So the hearing starts to begin to become very weak. And because the water element is dissolving, they're thirsty a lot. So a person in this stage of the dying process may be always asking for something to drink, something to drink. No matter how much they drink, they always feel like they're thirsty. So for example, in a hospice situation, you might notice the nurses keep swabs or ice cubes next to the patient's bedside and swabbing their mouth. They're always asking for something to drink, but they can't take a lot, so they're putting water in their mouth. A person will become incontinent. They lose the function of holding urine. They're not recognizing, usually not recognizing their loved ones. And the person's experience is they're seeing smoke. This is the mirage turns into a smoky appearance. They're feeling thirsty, they feel dry, and they're seeing smoke. And if they're talking, they're always asking for some water, something to drink. They may not hear you. If you're at their bedside and you're talking with them, they may not hear you. And they may not recognize you. And then when the water element is becoming completely dissolved, then the next element, which is the fire element, comes in and becomes the predominant element. And at this time, people sometimes show a fever. They get very, very hot. And this is the wind that's associated with the fire element is stationed in the throat chakra. And this is an energy that goes upward. It's called the upward moving wind. So the throat chakra is dissolving. The sense of smell is dissolving. At this point, they're not able to swallow. You'll feel the heat retracting from the limbs. Their feet and hands and their limbs will start to feel cool to the touch as the heat's going towards the center of the body. The sense of smell diminishes. And at this point, again, in a hospice situation, the nurses may be keeping wet towels on their forehead because they're always hot. They feel feverish. And when the fire element and the wind associated with the fire element in the chakra that supports the wind is completely dissolved, then finally we have the air element. And the air element dissolution is very obvious when a person is in this stage, because this is when they are having the Cheyne-Stokes type of breathing, the death rattle. Their respiration is very irregular. They may go for long periods of time between breaths. They're in the threshold of dying. This is the air element dissolving. And the wind, or the energy that's associated with this, is called the all-pervasive wind. And it's wind that flows all over the body. It's not stationed in a particular chakra. And the sense that is dissolving this is the sense of taste. And the crown chakra is also dissolving. At this point, a person is non-verbal, is not usually aware of what's going on around them. And finally, when the person has their last breath, which we call death, is when the air element has finished its dissolution. And so from a Western point of view, we call that death. But from this point of view, it's not completely death, because we still have one more element to go. We still have the most subtle element, the space element, which hasn't dissolved yet. So in some cultures, for example, the Tibetans and some cultures in Asia, and I think some other cultures around the world, after a person is clinically dead, they leave the body undisturbed for several days so that this final process can complete itself. But in a lot of places in the West, we don't have this idea. And as soon as a person is pronounced dead, they're taken to the morgue and sometimes cremated very quickly. So there's a lot of places that are now taking another look at this. And more, there are places that are willing to allow a person's body to be unremoved for longer periods of time if the family requests it. So the fifth, the space element dissolving is really the mind dissolving, right? The space element is associated with the mind or our awareness. And this dissolution is the final dissolution of these two side channels that I talked about. First, all the chakras have dissolved. And we still have the central channel and these two side channels. So the space dissolution is the two side channels becoming absorbed into the central channel. So first the upper part is absorbed into the crown. And at this point, a person will see white light. And then the lower part, those two side channels, are absorbed into the central channel, and the person will see red light. This is what the person who's dying is experiencing. First, a white light, because that's being absorbed into the crown chakra. And then when the bottom part is absorbed, they see red light. And the final stage of death is when these two white and red lights come into the heart chakra, into the heart, and dissolve into the most subtle part of the central channel. Then the consciousness splits from the physical support of the body and will migrate to another incarnation. So that's the definition of death in this tradition, is when the consciousness finally leaves from the heart chakra, and usually it leaves out the top of the head, but not always. And that takes about 3 days for that to happen. After the air element has dissolved, the person has stopped breathing, is usually pronounced dead. Then there's this subtle dissolution of the subtle parts of the core of the subtle body dissolving into the central channel. The experience of the white light, the red light, and then the two coming into the heart. And then the person goes unconscious. The person who has died is unconscious. They're not aware of anything at that point. So during the course of our life, these elements also determine our health and our state of health, or whether we're balanced or whether we have health problems. And systems like Tibetan medicine and Ayurvedic medicine deal with these elemental imbalances. And if we've had an imbalance during the course of our life, like let's say we've had an excess of earth element and we've had illnesses related to that dosha, or if we've had an excess of water element and we've had illnesses related to that, when we die, we will have trouble during this time. So if you've had an excess of earth element illnesses, when you go through the earth element dissolution at the time of death, you'll struggle. And this is where you see people really having a hard time. Lashing out, getting confused, really struggling with the dying process. Or if they're in the water element process and they're struggling, they're yelling out, they're fighting. And it's because they had an imbalance of that element during the course of their life. So practitioners who are aware of this process can do things at that point to help smooth that, to help with restoring balance so that they can go through that dissolution more quickly. Any questions so far? Is this all new material for you guys? Yeah? Okay. Some of it? Okay. Yeah.
How would you describe the process in a sudden death? Accident?
Same thing happens, but it happens like that. Yes. In sudden deaths, the same dissolutions are going to happen. They happen like that, but the final one of the space element dissolving is still going to take time. Okay?
What about the person who is in surgery and is using a lot of medicine, like, I don't know, that the conscious and awareness is a little bit more confused?
Yeah. You mean, what is the effect of anesthesia?
Yeah, because, I mean, for a person is going to change? Is going to be the same thing, or is something else happens?
Well, anesthesia doesn't cause the dissolution of the elements. The only other time that we start to experience this is during childbirth. When a woman is in labor and is giving birth, that is like a mini death. It's very similar to death. You never know when it's going to happen, and when it happens, you can't stop it, right? All you ladies who have had children? And when you go, if you go through a natural childbirth where you're not medicated, when you go through this period, what they call transition, where you're about to give birth, your elements are dissolving. It's like a death. You have to in order to release that child. So that's, women who go through childbirth are going through a little bit of that experience of the elements dissolving. But otherwise, anesthesia just turns off the conscious, that part of the brain. Yeah, it just turns off the part of the brain.
It's not going to get affected, even though there's a relationship between body and mind.
I think the consciousness is affected, sure. They know that it's affected by sound and what people say, right? But there's a lot of talk about near-death experiences where people describe going through tunnels and seeing white light, where they're going through some of this. That experience of going through the tunnel is the central channel. They're experiencing the winds dissolving in the central channel, and they're seeing it like this tunnel with this light. That's the light from the crown chakra. Okay, so they're starting to go through this process, and then they come back. That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah.
Can you give us a sample of what would be earth imbalance and water imbalance?
Mm-hmm. In Ayurvedic medicine and in Tibetan medicine, they have something called the doshas. Okay, so you have Pitta, Kapha, Vata. So Kapha is an earth imbalance, or what we say in English, phlegm. Earth imbalance is phlegm, and there's you can look in Ayurvedic medicine or Tibetan medicine and see, like arthritis is an example of an excess earth. Okay. Mm-hmm. Kapha, or bekan in Tibetan. So look at the doshas, and that's one place to go to get all kinds of detail about if this is imbalanced. These are the kind of illnesses that we have. Yeah.
Is there a way to, once you begin dissolving, let's say the more coarse liquid, stagnating it or so the process is not so quick, or even possibly reversing because at that level?
I don't think there's a way to reverse it, because what causes death to begin with? When somebody dies a natural, it's sort of a process that's going to happen, right? I don't think there's a way to reverse it, but I think there's ways to help a person through that process. So, for example, in one of the things that I teach this with harp therapy, using harp at the bedside for people who are dying. And we play music according to those elements, according to the modes. So there's music that's earth element music. There's music that's water element music. And if a person is struggling in one of those elements, we play music that is that element, and that helps them to go through that process. A Chinese doctor might do something different. They might do acupuncture or herbs that address that element.
So once it began, it has begun.
Yeah, once it's begun. Yes. Wouldn't that be nice if we knew how to reverse that?
I was wondering because, for something like the body, if there is an imbalance that's producing.
Yeah. Well, certainly when we have big imbalances, it will be the cause of our death. But that's sort of the healing part, right? You're trying to heal and balance those elements always. But whether that we can reverse death once it starts, maybe some great beings can. I see lots of hands. I don't know who had their hand up first. Who had, you did? Okay.
Is it the same for animals?
Yes, same for animals.
Even an insect? Is it
Mhm.
is there
Any
between an insect or a mammal?
any being that has the 5 elements body. So yes, any being that we can see, beings that we can't see don't have earth element. That's why we can't see them. But any being you can see, insect, animals, birds, they all have the same dissolution. Yeah. Yep.
What happens, I mean, when a person is really dying and you're resuscitated, medically speaking. So, that person already started the process of dissolution.
You mean like medical intervention where they put a person on life support? Yeah, that's a big controversy. That's a big ethical question.
But I don't mean an old person, I mean
Yeah.
an emergency situation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. People is literally dying and you're resuscitated.
Yeah, that's right.
Massage and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. So if you wouldn't do that, the person definitely would go.
Yeah, that's right.
He has a fibrillation.
Mm-hmm.
Way to go back except there is an intervention. So how would that? I mean, the person already would start the solution and that process, I guess.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's interesting to see it's reversing.
It's a really interesting question. And it's going to take doctors who are really familiar with this model to observe that. It's a really interesting question. But I think that we're probably catching it at the beginning stage of the dissolution with something like that. I think once a person is in fire going into air, it's really hard to reverse that.
It probably depend on that. If it's
Yeah.
successful.
Yeah.
You mentioned the space, which is the last
Mm-hmm.
element, and that in our culture, normally there's no period of time for that one
To settle. Yeah.
Then what happens? The dying process is not completed because we're cremated.
No, it's completed, but the person probably has a kind of a trauma experience, right? The person who's going through the white and the red dissolution process, that's disrupted, right? So however that affects their consciousness is going to carry with them into their next life. Okay, so the greatest gift that we can give a person who's dying is to help them to die in as peaceful and comfortable a way as possible, undisturbed, so that we don't shake up or disrupt that. Because how you die, the impressions that are made on your mind and in your energy, you're going to take with you wherever you're going. Right? So the best thing we can do is to create peace, quiet, stability, and comfort. So certainly there's a disruption. There's a disruption. And one of the things that my husband does mirror divination. He's a Tibetan that does a special kind of divination, and he can look in his divination when a person dies and tell where they're going and also how they're doing when they're in that bardo state. And it does show up again and again that when a person has not been able to complete that process in a nice way, they spend more time in the bardo. They spend a lot more time in the bardo. They don't take rebirth as quickly. So clearly it means it was somehow traumatic or somehow disruptive to their process or somehow confusing to them. They spend more time in the bardo.
What happened when a person is assisted to die? Did we alter the process?
A person is assisted to die, and what did you say after that?
We alter the process of the elements?
Mm-hmm. Like euthanasia? Well, what euthanasia does, a person will still dissolve the elements, but they haven't finished their karma. They haven't finished their karma. So whatever's left, they're going to bring that to the next life. This is the same thing with animals. If you euthanize your animal, you did not let them finish their karma. So even though we think we're putting them out of their misery and we don't want to watch them suffer, we're really doing it for us because we don't want to watch them suffer. And we don't have the time to sit with them and take care of them, right? But it's hard when a being is in pain and suffering. It's hard to be with that. But that is a karmic ripening. And if they don't finish that, they're going to take rebirth and be sick as a baby. They're going to bring that with them, what they didn't finish. And I don't think we'd want to wish that on anybody, right? So from a Buddhist point of view, that's the Buddhist belief. Buddhism does not advocate euthanasia in people or in animals because you're not allowing them to finish that karma. Better to help them be comfortable, take care of them, as much as possible. That's the kindest thing that we can do.
Would that be the same with suicide?
Yes, suicide, definitely. Definitely.
You're taking the karma then for the next life.
That's right. Whatever. Yes. And in fact, yeah, and those are very difficult situations. And in mirror divinations that my husband does, oftentimes people that commit suicide take rebirth in lower realms. Very hard to get a human rebirth after that. That's a very negative karma to take your own life. Yeah.
Take the space element and go first, and the other elements like subside, but they will not be completely.
Well, yogis do this very differently. I'm talking about like us, how we're going to die. Yogis it's a very different story. How they die, how they dissolve the elements, they do it with full conscious awareness, and they have practiced this in their yogic practices. So they dissolve their elements into light and attain the rainbow body, and their physical body will shrink. Shrink. And this is after they've stopped breathing, after they're clinically dead for a long time. They go through this dissolution process. Their physical body gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and there's rainbows everywhere because they're dissolving each of these 5 elements into light. So they have a very different experience of this. And they don't go into the bardo. That's a very special case. The VIP pass. Yeah, well, that's after a lot of practice. It's not an easy. That's after a lot of practice. And of course, in the Buddhist tradition, we're always practicing to die, right? That's what we're doing. We're always practicing to die. So
if they don't go into the bardo and they still need to reincarnate, they reincarnate immediately?
Well, they don't need to, no. They can choicefully. They can choose to come back if there's a need. Those are the bodhisattvas. Yeah. And then they can pick where they want to go. Instead of us, we go where we have unfinished karma with our parents. That's why we took rebirth where we took, because we didn't finish our karma with our parents. And if we're female, we didn't finish the karma with our father. If we're male, we didn't finish the karma with our mother. That's what determines our gender, is who we had the strongest karmic connection with at the time that we were conceived. That's what drew us there, some unresolved karma that we made. So in a way we choose our parents, but not really. We choose them because of some past action. But, yeah. Whereas a being like that, they can choose where they're going to be reborn and when or not. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had the privilege to witness this twice. Once with my own teacher in 2010, and recently last fall with my teacher's mother, who passed away in New York City. And I just thought this was the coolest thing. This yogini who had been living in New York City in Manhattan, doing a retreat in the middle of the heart of samsara. And she passed away in September and sat in what we call tukdam for 3 weeks. And there were rainbows all over New York City. They made the news. There was all these pictures of these amazing rainbows in New York City. Of course, nobody knew what was going on. And we were doing, there's 49 days where ceremonies are done, and I was there for part of that, and the energy of the place was just amazing. And they put her body in a box of salt. That's what they traditionally do, is they wrap up the body and they put it in a box of salt. And it was amazing that New York City's health department let them keep a corpse there for 49 days. That was really amazing. But somebody from the health department came in every day, and didn't notice any smell, so it was okay. And that was unprecedented that was allowed to happen. And it was pretty amazing to be. It's amazing to be in the presence of somebody who's dying that way, because the blessing energy is palpable. It's
So what
really.
did they put the body in salt? What?
When she finished her meditation, so she was in meditation, and so she was sitting. She was clinically dead, not breathing, no heartbeat, but sitting in meditation and looking like she's sleeping. So she didn't have that sunken feature of the face, skin didn't get gray. She was still warm here. She looked like she was sleeping, but she was clinically dead. And then she's going through this subtle dissolution of the elements. And in her case, it was almost 3 weeks. And then the body collapses like that. And a little red and white fluid comes from the nose. And then they put the body in salt until the rest of the 49 days. And in her case, they did have to take her to a traditional crematorium. Otherwise, like in Nepal, they would cremate in another way. But that was amazing. That was really special to witness that in the USA, in New York City. I thought, this is really great. She's really blessing New York City.
Is there any relationship of this we're talking about and corpses of saints?
I think that's the same. Like some of these Catholic saints, that they have their body. You go to some of these churches in Europe and they have the bodies there. I think it's the same. Same. Yeah. They've transcended the 5 elements, and in their own way, according to their own tradition. Yeah. There was, about 10 years ago, my husband was invited to speak at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California. And they were doing a symposium on the rainbow body. And he was invited to give a talk on his perspective from the Tibetan Buddhist point of view. And there was a Catholic priest there. I can't remember his name. Father... But he was really fascinated about this Tibetan rainbow body phenomena and had gone to Tibet to study, to talk with lamas and learn Tibetan. And he was convinced that this was Jesus' ascension. It was a rainbow body. He was convinced that they were the same thing. And so he presented something at the Institute of Noetic Sciences trying to draw parallels between the Catholic tradition and what they noticed in the rainbow body tradition. And then the Catholic Church told him to stop. We didn't hear from him after that, but yeah, I think there's definitely correlations there, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Many of us who are studying Buddhism and practicing, our families are not into this.
Yeah, sure.
And there may be moments when one would like them to understand this for our own death or for others.
Yeah.
But it's not a reality, and there may be screaming or yelling or crying. So as a practitioner, what do you do?
As a practitioner, what do you do if you're attending a family member?
Control the elements, other than, and now with this consciousness, one is more aware of the importance of telling our family.
Right.
What will happen.
That's right, and you observing and learning the signs, and then you can help people understand that this is why this is happening and this is what they're experiencing. But again, it comes down to, when somebody's dying, that's not the time to try to convert them to some other belief system, right? You've got to do what they want, whatever they want, whatever they need in that moment. To be there, to be the thing that people want the most is to feel support, to feel somebody's there, to try to address whatever emotional things are coming up, in whatever way. And besides that, for us Buddhist practitioners, there's all kinds of ceremonies and prayers and things to do, and they don't have to know that you're doing them. Okay, there's all kinds of things in our tradition to recite to help them take a better rebirth, to ease the process after they pass away. If you have them cremated, there's all kinds of things to do with their ashes that helps them take a better rebirth, helps them in the bardo. There's lots of things to do to help them in the bardo. Many, many things we can do, and they don't have to know that we're doing that.
Would you mention some of the things we can do?
Sure. Well, first of all, it depends on what kind of practitioner you are. So the simplest things to do are saying aspiration prayers and sutras. For example, there's a sutra called the Tsedo Tsesung Sutra, the Sutra of Amitayus. Yeah, that's very common. And that's reciting Amitayus' mantra over and over. It's a beautiful sutra. And that comes up in mirror divinations a lot. So when a person's actively dying, you can be reciting this. It even says in the sutra, if you whisper this mantra in an animal's ear, when an animal's dying and you say this mantra in their ear, they will take a human rebirth. So that's a very powerful one that anybody can do.
Which one?
Yeah, sometimes it's called the Sutra of Amitabha or the Tsedo Tsesung. You can find that online, download it. Ask a Lama to give you transmission for that. That's a very, very powerful and very doable one to do. And then there's commissioning lamas to do certain things. Like I said, the traditional one is 49 days of pujas. So if you have a connection with a lama who has a monastery in India or Nepal, you can commission them to do these ceremonies. And that really helps. Really, really helps a person. And they don't have to know that you're doing this. You just give them the person's name, make a donation, and this is one of the services that monasteries provide regularly are these kind of death ceremony pujas. Those are very, very helpful.
Is a POA practice?
POA practice, if you have a good practitioner who can really do POA at the time that they die, it has to be the right time. So, for instance...
Can you explain the practice a little for those who are...
Sure. POA is a practice where the consciousness at that final stage of the space element dissolving is ejected out of the person's central channel and sent to a pure land. So they can avoid being in the bardo. They can avoid all this migrating and taking rebirth. This is a very special practice that very skilled yogis can perform on people. It's not as effective if the Lama doesn't have a personal connection with that person. It's not as effective. So it's more effective if, say, we ask our Lama to do that for us when we pass away, or I've seen it work if you have a family member, but the Lama has a good connection with you, and through you, they do POA for your family member. But if they have no connection with the person whatsoever, it's not as effective. It's not as effective. And it requires somebody who's really skilled at doing it. So, and they usually have to be right there with that person. Okay, so if you have the good fortune to find a Lama at that time when the person's passing away. So I have seen it happen in the West where somebody's dying, somebody's in hospice, and they have a connection with a Lama, and they keep in contact, and so they're able, the family members are able to tell the Lama, okay, we're getting very close, and the Lama's available to do POA. It definitely has happened. You got to line up all those conditions. Mm-hmm.
Is it really important to touch the crown when the body is...
I wouldn't.
Some people will say do that, and some
Yeah.
people will say don't do that.
Yeah. My personal experience when a person is on the verge of death is don't touch their crown. Yeah.
Don't touch them at all?
Well, you can touch them if you're holding their hand or however you've been relating to them. You know, I don't know, you know, there's a million variations of that, but yeah, it's not necessary. I think the idea is touch their crown so their consciousness will leave out their crown. Yeah. That won't make their consciousness leave out their crown, leave out of the crown. That has to do with their karma. Yeah. So, yeah.
Another question that comes up is if you're a practitioner and
Yeah.
you're dying,
Yeah.
but your family is really not into this.
Uh-huh. That's a discussion you need to have with your family long before you die. Really. In writing, too. Absolutely. I think we have to start more Buddhist hospices, personally. You know. Yeah. So that your wishes can be respected. It's important to respect a person's beliefs at the time of death. So really good hospices will do that, you know. So it's really, really important. You don't want to disturb their mind or create stress at that time.
I mean, but you can get prepared to them.
Excuse me?
I mean, if there's no way you can convince your family,
Yeah.
you can work it with yourself so that, you know, it doesn't affect you. You just understand them, let them be.
You can try. Yeah.
That's very interesting because when you had a trauma, when you have a trauma and you're struggling and you are a Buddhist practitioner, those are moments when you even forget what you say, right? Because
That's
you're
right.
still in the path.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like those moments of practice of when it's really going to happen.
Yeah.
So you really need somebody to help you through that.
You do. And we don't know how we're going to die. That's the thing. We can prepare and prepare, but we really don't know how we're going to die. And when. So a good practitioner is always prepared, right? And then we get to see the moments when we really weren't. Like those times when you're on a flight, you know, and then suddenly like you're hitting turbulence and it's, you know, it's like, yeah, then you realize how helpless you really are. You think about those people that were, you know, the people that were recently killed in France and what they must have gone through. I think about that and I think, would I have been able to hold the space in that moment? I wonder about that. You know, I wonder about those, how strong my practice would be in a situation like that. You know, I use that for fuel for my practice. Because we don't know how we're going to die. Gosh, there's a million, trillion ways to die. So...
Have you had experience with a dream yoga as a preparation for
No. There's a practice called Bardo in the yogas that is a direct, but all practices are preparation for death, actually. All practices are mindfulness. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I had an experience which it was very long ago, and I still learn from that experience because it was a dying person.
Yeah.
She was a woman, and she was pretty young. She was roughly 6 years old, and she was in the hospital because of irreversible asthma. And so it just happened I was on duty that night, and the nurse called me to go to see the patient because she was restless. So I went to her, and she was kind of almost sitting because she had her bed raised, you know, because of the respiratory problem. And I talked to her. I said, "Are you alright?" And she said, "No, I'm not alright." So, can I help you? She said she was looking. She was staring. She didn't look. She was staring. Like that part of the vision part. She was dissolving. And she just stared at the window or something. She stared. And then I said, "Well, okay." She said, "Don't leave, don't leave." Then she didn't look at me, but she didn't want So I went back to her and she said, I'm so hot. There was no hot or, it was cool, it was everything. So she wanted me to put the fan on her, so that's another part of the step. Now I'm saying all of it, but at that moment, there was a moment she was so restless and she saw fear, she had so much fear. So I didn't have any knowledge except hold her hand and say, don't worry. What are you seeing something? And she said, oh yes, I'm seeing it. You say, well, just look at it. You know, isn't it pretty? Then I just started with it, you know.
Yeah.
And I said, and then she says, I'm kind of leaving. And I said, well, no. I don't remember the words I said, but I said something like, well, go floating, you know, enjoy the process, you know. that was the only thing. And she died holding my hands.
Yeah.
But that was a big reflection for me afterwards because I'm a physician.
Yeah.
I should be, you know, pounding her hard and, you know, putting to her. That was a normal thing in the hospital. So I didn't do any of that, but I was not feeling that was right because she was already in this process. I didn't have any knowledge, but I had the feeling.
You use your intuition.
That I had
Yeah.
to her.
Yeah.
And my superiors questioned what I did.
Oh.
But they were not there, so they would not
Yeah.
exactly what was happening.
Yeah.
It was very fast. I mean, I think it was one of, since I was called by a nurse until she died, I think it was no more than maybe 25 to 30 minutes. And she went through all these processes very fast. And I'm still learning from that experience. So I just wonder where she is or what she's, what the process was and everything.
How wonderful you were there for her, otherwise she would have been alone.
Yeah, she would.
Yeah?
She would be with two things.
Yeah, yeah.
The other thing I remember is my father died some years ago, and the whole family we were with him all the time. And then he had this process of, you know, breathing more regularly.
Yeah.
And then it was very late and we were very tired, so we went to sleep with him, you know, staying. And then one of my sisters, she was awake and she said, I think he's leaving right now. So we went around him and started praying, you know, till he died. But the only thing I regret was that I didn't know about this other after physical death. We immediately bring to him to the authority department.
Yeah.
It was in the hospital.
Yeah, yeah.
So
That is.
process that we, you know, my sister and me, myself, you know, put all the things up to another place.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Dad.
Yeah. I think that's probably the one thing, if we change anything, you know, or request anything for our own death to be left alone for a couple days after, that's the one thing to try to make a change in that will really benefit.
More than one day, but it was in the freezer.
That's okay. That's okay. It's when people get cremated very soon.
We got cremated about 1 day after.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here it's 48 hours by law, right? So
Yeah.
we have to wait 48 hours. Would that time make a difference if the person is a practitioner or isn't? Or it wouldn't?
It depends on how the dissolution went. It's hard to say. It's so variable. Just because somebody's a good practitioner doesn't mean they die in a good way. And and I think things like if somebody is, has cancer and is using morphine, for example, it's going to affect a person's mental alertness and things like
That's why a lot
that.
of
Yeah.
Buddhists reject using.
Yes. Yeah, because they want to be aware. That's right.
It's a tough call.
It is a tough call. Yeah. It is. And in the end, we have to respect the person who's dying and what they want and need in that moment. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah.
About the things we can do. You were saying about doing the Virgo.
Uh-huh.
You also
Mm-hmm.
can
Body, the energy body, and some of you may be familiar with this idea. So besides our physical body, or what my teacher calls our meat body, is a body that we can't see, but some of us can see it, and we can certainly observe and feel this body. And the body is made up of a system of winds, or energy, or prana. In Tibetan, they use the word wind, or lung. So in English, it gets translated as winds. So if you read Tibetan medical texts or tantric texts, they'll talk about the winds. But they're talking about prana, for those of you who are familiar with that word. And a system of channels, or networks, for which this energy flows. And in short, the channel system is based on a central or main channel that runs through the vertical core of our body, from the crown of our head, down in front of our spine, down to 4 fingers below the navel. That's the root, or the trunk, of this channel system. Some people call it the central channel, or in Tibetan they call it Uma. In Sanskrit, the Sushumna. Okay, so some of you, if you have a little yoga background or you do pranayama, you might hear it by that name, Sushumna. In English, it's usually translated as central channel. It's about the thickness of our thumb. That's the main branch. And besides that, our 2 smaller, there's no heat in the body, right? The air element is the breath. It's also the movement of nerve impulses, or movement in general, moving our limbs, walking, that's all considered an air element activity. And finally, the space element is our consciousness, our mind, or our awareness. So these are the 5 fundamental constituents of the body. And in the dying process, these elements dissolve. And they dissolve in order of the most dense to the most subtle. So the order that they dissolve in is the earth first, the densest, then water, then fire, then air, then space. So we're going to talk about each of those phases, what it looks like as an observer, if we're attending to somebody who's in the dying process, and also what it's like to experience that, each of the dissolutions. But the other thing that we have to talk about a little bit is our subtle body, because the dissolution process is actually the dissolution of our subtle energies in the body, and the elements are dependent on that. So when we die, when our physical body dies, the subtle energies are dissolving and leaving the body, and there's all these physical signs. So we have to talk a little bit about that, the subtle branches that go on either side of the main branch. And they begin at the top of our nose and travel down either side, all the way down to the bottom, and then come back inside the base of the central channel. And these 2 channels are called different names. There's one on the right and there's one on the left. You could say that one is for the masculine principle and one is for the feminine principle, or the solar and the lunar energies. And then along certain areas of the central channel are the chakras. I think many of you have heard that word, chakra. Chakras are places where there's many, many, many of these little channels concentrated. Okay, there's chakras, the main points on the body. And those chakras branch out. So inside these channels flows this energy, this wind, lung, prana. And there's 5 different kinds of this energy, the 5 different winds. that are associated with the different chakras, that are associated with the different elements. So when we die, these winds you could say they evaporate, dissipate. So the element that's dependent on that wind dissolves or is not as present. And the physical structure of the body that was dependent on that, we see the physical changes. So the dying process begins with this subtle wind losing its force or leaving the body or disintegrating, which in turn causes that element to lose its energy, which in turn causes us to see certain things in the physical body. Okay, so this is the Tibetan view of the dying process. It begins on an energy level in a systematic way. Okay, so the first element to dissolve is the earth element. And when the earth element dissolves, this can actually take a long time in a person who's maybe elderly, is not particularly sick, and maybe dies of natural causes. We can observe the earth element dissolving when somebody begins to become more feeble. Their body becomes weak. They might shrink, actually physically shrink. Suddenly, seems like somebody shrinks. They're not as active anymore. They don't want to walk around. They don't want to do anything. They don't have energy. They might start to feel fear because there's a sense of the ground beneath them giving way. So they have more fear. All these are kind of behaviors that you start to see in some elderly people. And they're not particularly dying at that time. We wouldn't say that they were dying, but actually the earth element is starting to dissolve, and they're starting to show these signs of weakness, of fear, of their body shrinking, their body becoming more feeble, maybe shaking. They don't have strength. Some new faces here. So tonight we're going to talk about dying. Something we all have to do. And it's kind of funny we have to talk about this because we've done it so many times. But somehow we just don't remember. So we have to talk a little bit about the death and dying process from the Tibetan Buddhist point of view. And this is a talk that Veronica requested that I give, and specifically on the dissolution of the elements in the dying process. So this is assuming that we understand that we are made of the 5 elements. Yesterday's talk on the mandala, we talked a little bit about the elements. So from this worldview, it's seen that our bodies are made out of earth, water, fire, air, and space. The earth element is the solidity of the body, the bones, the flesh. That what gives us support and strength. That's the earth quality or the earth element of the body. The water element of the body is the fluids of the body, the blood, the lymph. The fluids of the body is the water element. The fire element is the heat of the body, our temperature. If we're dead,